All right. Hello, everybody. Good evening to you, to those of you in India, and good morning to those of us in Chicago who are up at this hour. It's a pleasure to join you. My name is Paul Staniland. I'm a faculty member at the University of Chicago, and I'm going to be helping to moderate today's event. This is an event between the University of Chicago's Delhi Center, which does a wide range of really impressive and interesting events and projects in Delhi, bringing together the University of Chicago and India's academic and public communities with Ashoka University's Trivedi Center for Political Data. And I'm very pleased to be joined by the co-director of the Trivedi Center, Gilles Verniers, who is also an assistant professor of political science at Ashoka University. Before I forget, I just want to say, if you have questions as today's event goes on, please put them in the chat box down below, and we'll kind of get to a Q&A session after some presentations and conversation, but put your questions in the chat, and we will address them there. I'm also very pleased to be joined by a pair of research engineers and junior research fellows at the Trivedi Center for Political Data. Srishti Gupta is a research engineer and junior research fellow, and Neelesh Agrawal is also a research engineer and junior research fellow. And they're going to be offering their insights both into what the data say and also how they got it and what they have to do with it to make this kind of topic kind of legible to social scientists. So we're going to begin with Gilles giving an overview, and we'll take it from there. We'll have about 20 to 30 minutes of presentations and conversations, then we'll open it up for question and answer. So Gilles, after you, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction, and thank you very much to the Chicago Center in Delhi for hosting this second iteration of our discussions in and around Indian political data. And so today we're talking about the changing profile of India's political class, but really we're going to try to do two things. One, we're going to talk about Indian leaders, we're going to talk about politicians and how their profile may have changed over time, and also how some long-term trends have also endured. But we also talk about what it actually takes to produce the information that we need to study a topic like the sociology of India's political class. So in the first part, I will cover some aspects of the profile of India's politicians. I will focus more on the Lok Sabha MPs, but I'll make some connections to state assemblies, political class as well. And then my colleagues Srishti and Neelesh will talk about sort of the behind the scene of political data production. So before I get actually into the data itself, I think it's useful to set up, why studying representation matter. Why should we care about who MPs are? There's a whole argument that political parties matter more than candidates, that leadership in executive matter more than individual representatives or parliament. But I think it's important to hammer the point that political representation through elected assemblies still matter a great deal. In the context of India, for instance, the way we think about representation is still very much based or dominated on an idea of descriptive representation, that MPs are not just individuals representing their constituents, but they also belong to groups and categories and represent those groups and categories. So there's a matter of representation of collective interest. Parliament is the seat of popular sovereignty. So obviously we should pay attention to who occupy that institution. The composition of parliament is a good indicator whether politics, to the level of at which politics gets, it becomes inclusive or not. We can look at who are the groups and categories that are represented, overrepresented, underrepresented, to get a sense of who gets to have a voice in politics. And also, and there's a very rich literature on this, that basically states representatives, who the representatives are matter because who gets recruited and how they recruited very often has a bearing on how politicians behave once they are elected in power. And one of the arguments that I make is that the conditions of entry into politics bear a large impact or effect on how politicians behave once they are elected. And obviously, MPs also matter because necessarily ministers, get recruited. So even if you think that the executive matters, but it still emerges out of parliament, in a way. And then finally, who gets elected over time? When you put all this data in a timeline, it gives you a good indication also of deeper political trends that might be at play. So let me get into this immediately with, what do we know about India's MPs? And I'll try as much as possible to give you a sense of, historical trends, not just to look at the composition of the Lok Sabha right now. And so we know that India's parliament is heavily male dominated. Only 14.4% of MPs are women in 2019. That's the highest ratio that it's ever been. And you can see how the growth of women representation has been steady, but very, very slow over time. We know also that the Lok Sabha has an overrepresentation of the majority religion of Hindus. Hindus represent roughly 83% of India's population, but they make more than 90% of the MPs, barring a couple of exceptions like in 1980. But here also you see great consistency of those trends over time. Apologies. We often have the perception of India's political class as, of India being this gerontocracy, very old leaders in power for a very long time. But when you look at the median age of Indian MPs, it's actually not so high. It's at 54. Which is pretty much in tune with parliaments across the world. So there's no reason to think that Indian politicians may be older, generally speaking, than their counterparts in other countries. But we see that the share of elder or older MPs, slightly grows over time, over the past 30 years, over the past 30 years. In terms of occupation, this is where things show more dramatic change, in the sense that in the past, there were really two socio-professional categories that dominated India's parliament. Agriculturists, up till the late 80s, would easily make nearly half of all MPs. And then you had another very good chunk of MPs who would be lawyers or declare law as their profession. And the data that we have gives us a very clear indication that the number of MPs who declare farming as their occupation has dramatically declined. From between 1999 and 2019, it's been reduced more or less by half. And what we know from a closer observation of what lies behind this data is that actually the number of MPs who come from a business background has actually increased quite a lot. This is not reflected in the data here, and it's a good opportunity for me to show how we should never take this kind of data at face value, because when we have data from various sources, usually what happens is that we get very, very different data. So you see here, for instance, this data that comes from the Who's Who, the parliamentary Who's Who, based on declared information by MPs, shows that in 2019, after 2019, there's still quite a lot of MPs who are yet to declare what occupation they have. But if you look at the affidavits, which is the document that they have to file and sign ahead of the election when they file for nomination to become a candidate, you see that those numbers indicate that the actual share of agriculturists could actually be much lower than what is reflected in the Who's Who data, and that the share of businessmen MPs is actually much higher than what gets, reflected here. And information that we collect from the ground, years or so of, spent doing, field work and talking to politicians, show that over time you have more and more MPs and MLAs who come from a local business background. So in terms of the occupational profile of MPs changes quite significantly over time. Now, of course, when we talk about representation in India, when we talk about descriptive representation, almost immediately, we talk about caste. And here we actually introducing new data curated by TCPD and a vast network of research collaborators and partners to basically show the evolution of the caste composition of the Lok Sabha over time. And it tells you basically a story that we've been somewhat, familiar with, which is a story of decline of representation of upper caste, but upper caste that nonetheless remain the single largest group represented in parliament through time. The rise of OBCs is from the late 80s through the 1990s. They peak in 2004 and then sort of reach a plateau after 2004, right? But a graph like this, of course, is very aggregate. It gives you a very overall trend. It gives you some interesting indications, which, for instance, the recent rise of upper caste in politics actually dates from 2009 and not 2014, as it's often attributed as, accompanying the rise of Hindu nationalists, the rise of the BJP. On the one hand, the rise of the BJP does bring a large number of upper caste politicians into the arena. But if you put the data into a timeline, you see that certain trends predate actually the rise of the BJP. So you can treat a chart like this and data like this really as a starting point. And then what you can do is basically start, breaking down. You can look at larger regions and you see that the Hindi belt, the 10 North Indian Hindi-speaking states show a similar trends that the national trend, only more exacerbated, right? And here again, the rise of upper caste is particularly pronounced, but in 2009 and not in 2014. Actually, upper caste representation has even declined a little bit in 2019, which has to do with notably the BJP opening more its doors to non-upper caste groups. And from there, you can continue the exploration. You can, of course, obviously, upper caste, OBC, SC, ST, these are very broad categories, which you need to break down at the Jati level. And here, to just give you two examples, again, from the Hindi belt, you see, the differentiated trajectories of representations of Brahmins and Rajputs, right? And what this tells you is that this phase of decline of upper caste representation was really a phase of decline of Brahmin representation, which they have recuperated, right? And at the same period, Rajput's representation actually kept progressing. Why? Because they actually found representation within the parties that would win in the Hindi belts, in many cases regional parties, or across Congress in the BJP in bipolar states. Another significant chart here looks at the share of representation of what we call dominant versus non-dominant OBC groups. In the context of UP, for example, we would put Yadavs and Kurmis among the dominant groups. There are large groups, they own assets, they're politically assertive for a long time. And the non-dominant OBCs belong to a large array of smaller groups who tend to be poorer. And what we see is that this confirms the idea that a small number of powerful, assertive groups sort of trusted representation of backward groups over a long period of time. But in recent years, the trends show very clearly that that's actually been reversed, right? And that has a lot to do with the BJP strategy of including candidates and therefore MPs and MLAs at the state level from non-dominant OBCs, providing them with more representation. So even if you see that overall OBC representation, is more or less stable or has plateaued, within that category, you actually see quite a lot of churning. And then you can also go down further at the state level. Right, and you see that these ideas of caste churning, this idea of rise of backward castes, or decline of dominant group or decline of upper caste, may be actually more state-specific than all India at large. Right, so on the left here you have UP, which again shows very clearly these trends of constant decline of upper caste representation as regional parties rise. A rise also of Muslims representation quite pronounced through the 90s and the early 2000s, and a somewhat stable representation of OBCs after a period of impressive rise again in the late 80s and early 90s. And here obviously you see the BJP effect. The BJP comes to power with a single majority, and it puts back upper caste representation to where it was before the Mandal period. And so you see a lot of churning in a huge state, in a big state like UP. But if you turn to Karnataka, you see that trends are actually very stable, right? And for those of you familiar with Karnataka politics, you know that Karnataka politics is dominated essentially by two groups, Lingayats and Vocaligas, that their representation, both these groups represent roughly make half of the representation in the Karnataka Assembly. And that their respective representation actually is also very stable through time. And when you actually put that data on a map, you understand why, because these two groups dominate in separate parts of the state, right? So when you look at caste and politics, you need to include also geography. And geography in this case tells you that it doesn't really matter who wins an election, right? 2013 had a particular result, 2018 had a very different results. But those two groups and other groups as well, like OBCs in coastal Karnataka, for example, keep winning because they're so dominant in the areas where they are most present that all parties try to attract them and provide them representation, right? And so the data is interesting as a point of departure to look into all those specific state trajectories. And while we think overall we have this perception of big churning, in representation in India, there's actually a large number of states, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, even West Bengal, where representation patterns are, dead stable through time, even when you have political alternation, even when you have a regime change, such as West Bengal after 2012. Right, so this is a really snapshot aperçu of who Indian MPs and some of the characteristics of India's political class. Now the second aspect, and I'll be quick here, is what do we know about politicians' career? Because it's one thing to look at social characteristics, but we also have to look at individuals, right? It may be you may have a certain number of women in politics, but if it's a different women, if there are different women elected every time, then it does not necessarily lead to a lot of empowerment because women don't get to do very long careers. And as it happens, that is the case for most Indian politicians. One of the most interesting findings that we got, I think, from this data is the short duration of politicians' career. The chart here tells you the proportion of first-time MPs in the Lok Sabha. And for someone well-versed in American political literature, these numbers would be absolutely shocking like what we call the incumbency advantage, the advantage that one has when rerunning as a sitting member of Congress or the Senate are huge. And it's very hard actually to challenge a sitting MP or a sitting member of Congress from below. But in India, it seems to be actually quite easy. And in fact, most MPs tend to be first-time MPs. And as you can see, those trends, the trend holds over time. Of course, in the 60s and 70s, you had a lot of churning. But even in the 90s, when you had closer elections, you still had a fair number of MPs who would be, elected for the first time, right? So most Indian politicians are actually first-term politicians. On the one hand, you have a strong individual incumbency, anti-incumbency. So Indian voters tend to vote against the person they voted in the previous election. And that's a phenomenon that is also induced by political parties who rotate their candidates. What do I mean by that? You can see that in this chart here, where the ratio of rerunning MPs is actually quite low. So in 2019, when 63% of incumbent MPs rerun, it means that nearly 4 MPs out of 10 did not get a chance to keep their seat, did not get even a chance to, either they were denied their tickets or they left politics altogether. Some of them maybe passed away, but more in the more general case is comes from parties who keep changing candidates. And you see that among those who rerun, the strike rate or the success ratio of these rerunning MPs is very, very low, right? In 2019, only 42% of the 63% of MPs, of incumbent MPs who rerun were actually re-elected, which shows that even when a party keeps a majority, it can hide enormous turnover of candidates and elected representatives at the constituency level. And that fuels the idea that, political careers are, extremely, extremely short. And what I find interesting in this chart, again, is the fact that this has been a constant in India's political life, right? It's true for the 60s, it's true for, every decade you have a significant number of MPs who do not get a chance to rerun. And the success rate, of course, it varies, a little bit through time, but it's only in 1999 that it crosses 50%, right? Which means that a majority of those who rerun lose, which of course incite political parties to discard their incumbents because incumbents don't necessarily make strong candidates. And one consequence of this, and I'm nearing the end now, is that what I call India's stable political class, or the true professionals of politics, those who make politics their true profession. And I measure that, it's a fairly arbitrary measure, but I measure that by people who get elected more than twice, right? You can get elected, if you're lucky, if you're in a strong party, you may get re-elected, but the third time you're likely to, those who win their seat when their party lose, right? Those are the actual Paka netas, Paka politicians who make a true career out of that. And what you see is that the number of these politicians is actually very small. Only 120 MPs in the current Lok Sabha have been elected more than twice, which is also a measure of how power is concentrated into the hands of a tiny political elite, which manages to last through time, which can weather eventually defeat, come back to power, people who belong to the close circle of leadership and who gets protection and who gets the easier maybe constituencies, or who have a strong hold over the over the constituencies. There's a variety of possibilities here, but the actual political class, if you remove those fly-by-night or one-term politicians, is actually really, really small in a country of 1.3, 1.4 billion. And if you look at the state level, apologies, yeah. If you look at the state level, you see interesting variations. In a state like Karnataka, more than half of the politicians actually are sort of long-serving politicians, right? Goa also has a good chunk of people who last in politics. So does Orissa. But then you come down and about, after 10 states, you're below the 30% mark. And there you have a large number of states where your stable political class get really small. The bottom of the ranking actually is Uttar Pradesh, where barely 7% of MLAs actually have served more than twice. And again, in those states, it is a measure of how concentrated political power is within the hands of a very small political elite. So a couple of observations to end, not to end, but to sort of mark a pause in the conversation, is that one can say that India's political class is elitist, right? You still have an overrepresentation of upper caste. It's very male dominated. So there are, I haven't spoken about money. Obviously, the cost of entry into politics filters in the wealthiest, candidates. And so there are, in many ways, Indian politics, the political class is very elitist. But at the same time, and that is unusual, I think, it's also highly competitive with a very high turnover of who those elites actually are. And these are trends that go back literally to independence, right? Even when we're currently working on the 50s, but the data tells us the same story, that even when the Congress was ultra dominant, you still had a huge churning of politicians at the constituency level. And so the fact of elitism is not new, but the configuration of it, evolves. Less farmers, more MPs from a business background, and so forth. The sources of elitism, it's not very complicated. It's party recruitment. Parties have incentives to recruit strong candidates who tick all the boxes of winnability, the cost of entry into politics, but also the cost of early exit. What sense does it make to spend crores for an election when you know that in all probability, you're only going to serve 5 years, right? And then as another source of turnover, power concentration within party, a very high individual anti-incumbency, which can show also that Indian voters may have opinions about the parties they like, but they usually have strong negative opinions about their individual representatives. And some of the implications of those long-term trends and that long-term elitism in political representation is that it makes it all the more difficult for women, members of religious minorities, other vulnerable groups to enter politics. And therefore, the claims that parties make about being inclusive really need to be relativized. So this is what I have for the moment, and I'll now hand it over to Srishti. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilles. Hi, everyone. So I'll go more in depth about the charts and the tables Gilles presented, how we are able to come to it. Neelesh, can you please share the screen of the presentation? So this is the data analysis pipeline. It can be broken down into 5 steps. First is you define the problem statement, you get the data, you clean it, you build visualizations, derive insights, and then you reiterate and keep developing, keep updating it over time. However, with the data coming from the public resources, the second and the third step is not as straightforward. That is getting the data and cleaning the data. Next slide, please. Okay, so these 2 steps they go through this complete pipeline. First is that you curate the data and you develop a schema. So this is based on the scope of the project, that what your data set will be about. After that, you do the data extraction. Now, since the data is coming from various types of sources, for example, PDFs, websites, scanned documents, sometimes these are PDFs which could be properly structured, and sometimes it could be photos only. Then after that, you decide what is the best strategy to extract data from each of the sources, and you merge all the data and you reach at this stage, which is called primary consolidation. At this stage, you have to restudy your schema because whatever variables you had decided earlier, they might not be present, or you may have to expand to include other variables in your data set. This is where data enrichment happens at the parallel level. After this, you reach at the final consolidation state. At the final consolidation state, you have a data set which has all the data. Now you have to check whether this data is consistent for all the entries that you have and whether you are able to meet the traceability back from the source where you started. So over here, you also check for the logical fallacies, any errors that you get into the data. And then it is followed by documentation. Documentation is very important to make the dataset replicable for other work. This is followed by visualization, which is the last step, where you make the dataset interactive to develop visualizations and insights. And then you are able to say that, okay, now we are ready for release and we can do further study with this dataset and the visualizations. However, there are a lot of challenges which come. Yeah, next slide. So during the data curation part, many times the data is not available at the source, or if it's available, it's closed. It's inaccessible by the public. So the solution for this is either you file RTIs, you do the field visits, you search for physical archives. Next is data extraction. So as many times the data is inconsistent, unstructured or semi-structured. So you do different types of scraping. You bring different kind of scraping solutions. If it's a website, you can do web scraping, which is very easy. However, if it is scanned documents, you can run OCR, which is optical character recognition tools. However, many times you don't find such data and you get photographs. Then you have to rely on manual encoders to fill in those gaps. Next is when you have this data extracted and you do the primary consolidation, many times you face errors like you'll get duplicate data or homonyms, or there will be spelling error, or sometimes like missing information. And since the data is from different region, the data can be available in regional languages, and for analysis, you will have to convert it into English. And so for this, the alternative source of you will have to rely on alternative source of information, that is through newspaper, archives, interviews, or for language, you'll have to use language processing tools, different libraries, or sometimes you'll have to rely on manual encoders only, because the online tools right now available with the state of art are also not reliable and sufficient. And then for the duplicate issues, for mapping for mapping a career of person, you may have to build in-house tools like SURF, which TCPD has built. So yeah, these are the challenges that we face. Now I'll hand it over to Neelesh to go more in depth about what kind of sources we get for one particular data set and other data sets. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Srishti. So of course, like this gives you maybe a sort of holistic image of how any sort of data scraping would, or like data consolidation would work. And we have used similar mechanisms to build a lot of data sets at TCPD. And so for the purpose of this presentation, I'll focus on the Lok Sabha data set that we have come up with. And of course, so Gilles presented information around a bunch of different values, sociological information, caste information, and also the political trajectories. And this data is not like, there is no, I mean, there is one which is low, which is like us right now. There's no, but otherwise there's no one-stop shop to get this data. And we have to like extract this to, let's say, public institutions, through other organizations that have some of this data, they process it, or we have to go to public records to get further information. So there's a wide variety of this data set. So I'll just go through some of the examples of data, or how this data sources look like. So of course, one is what the ECI itself releases, which is like right before the elections. That is what we have here, which is the candidate affidavits. We get very basic information, which constituency the person is contested from. Most importantly, the name of the candidate. And so this forms a sort of base of the data. And after elections, of course, ECI releases information around the vote share that everyone got. And they also release a statistical report, which is typically 3 to 6 months after the actual result announcement. which is a very important source of verification of this information, where they do the vote tally, they make sure that everything fits and the right candidates have been elected, etc. So this is what this there is released. But of course, like till here, we only have the name of the candidate, we have their electoral information. But this kind of information that Gilles shared, it's either some of it is contained within the affidavit, which is also processed by ADR, which is available in a better web format here. And even beyond this, sometimes you have to go to like very varied sources. And so we have the Lok Sabha Who's Who, which is on the website. They have their own, all the elected members' bio profiles. This can be, in the case of Lok Sabha, as you can see, it's in English, it's very legible, and it's on a web page. Then there is, in the case of Gujarat, we have this in Gujarati, which adds another layer of complexity to this data set. And so we have to process this, but it's still fairly neatly structured. And then finally, we have something like Rajasthan State Who's Who books, which are not even very well structured. It's a statement, and this is an image PDF. So this is like very varied sources. So how we treat this data and how we finally come up with the final consolidated data set is this. And so practically what you see here, the ECI data, which we treat as the baseline of the data, because this is very well verified. We're fortunate to have a very efficient election commission that verifies this data. So this we treat as a baseline. But of course, we want to add a bunch of data. So as you can see the rectangles, which is, let's say you want to add the caste information, there is the sociological information or the political trajectory information, which informs of these anti-incumbency measures, etc. And so in the context of the Lok Sabha data, we have different sources for sociological information, the affidavits, as well as Who's Who. So as you can see, the affidavits we've been able to scrape, but in case of Who's Who, sometimes it's scraped, but when it's very well disorganized data at the source, we have to even rely on manual entry of the data. And once we have this information, it's not just enough to just fill it in. And the diamonds that you see are typically, these are tools or mechanisms that we have come up with in-house to be able to assimilate this data into our core data more effectively. And so quite simply, I'll go through some examples for this. Like, so what the spellings that we get from the Who's Who books, they might not necessarily match what the candidates file. So for that, we need to be able to match the names. So a very, very classic example that we typically give is, and someone recognizable is, we have a name like L.K. Advani versus Lal Krishna Advani. And we've had his name in multiple spellings across years and across different data sets. So to be able to merge that, of course, like Srishti hinted at, there are some tools available. But again, they do not perform very well on Indian names. And so we basically looked at the architecture and we came up with our own version of it and decided to use that instead. And over time, we have made multiple iterations to improve it. And so that is how we get this data. So that's what SURF does. It also does similarly within Dataset, which is to track incumbency, let's say, across elections also. Someone might contest with different names or like very slight spelling differences. And that can even happen because of translations, etc. So we're able to map them across datasets similarly. Then we have a bunch of unstructured columns. And of course, like as you can see, there's the profession category that we went in some depth about. But we don't necessarily have that in the format that you just saw, because we might have people call themselves farmers, they might call themselves agriculturists. So there are a bunch of categories. In fact, there are nearly 10,000 different terms that we extracted from the affidavits, and then we map those onto these categories. So even in terms of business, we have values like real estate developer, and within that, because this is manually filled in by the candidates when they're filing in, within that there are a bunch of spelling errors. So we go through a very intense codification and categorization process, which is using mostly classic NLP methods. We create a pipeline, and that adds these columns. And then coming to the caste information, so most of this, this is something Gilles mentioned also, this comes from a wide network of our field researchers who share this information with us. And then it is sent through a data collation tool that we're developing. And so what that is meant to do is sort of work on the intercoder reliability of the data, where two different people will send us information about the same candidate. And so we need to make sure that, the cast values are correct. So it's also a correctness check. And again, like even our tools sort of interact with each other. So whatever codification we come up with, so if we have a jati and then we give it a caste category, etc. Not we give it, like we derive that this must be the caste category. So we have to give it back to the data collation tool so that it's able to process new incoming entries, etc. So not to get too technical though. And then finally, after this process is when we are able to merge this to consolidate all of this data together. And so we typically add these as new columns into the ECI data rather than, so that still remains our base data set because it's the most verifiable source. And then we have this bunch of other sources. We do have to do a bunch of processing to get to our final data set. So that's about how complicated it can get. And I won't go into further technical details, but open to questions around that.
Thank you.
Wrap up this part.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I learned an enormous amount about both kind of the patterns and, actual both changes in continuity, and also how you do all of this, which turns out to be extremely complicated and maybe more so than I naively had realized. So I have a couple of questions I was wondering between the three of you, kind of if you have thoughts on. The first is about, and maybe we can keep the answers fairly brief to get a few questions in here, families. So one of the tropes about Indian politics is there are these dynastic kind of families. And I'm wondering, as you look at the data about the turnover, there's so many first term, one term, really, legislators, that seems in conflict with this idea of kind of these dynastic families. So what should we rethink about Indian politics kind of when it comes to family politics and political families?
So I think, thank you, Paul. So I think a useful way to think about these questions, be it, dynasticism or even, crime and money and dominant caste and so forth, is to sort of deconstruct this notion of winnability, what makes a candidate winnable. And very often I find that these are more criteria of desirability or selectability from the point of view of parties who try to maximize their chances to win a seat by recruiting candidates who tick all those boxes, including political families, including dynasticism and so forth. But the statistical work that we've done on the performance of those candidates does not necessarily indicate that they always do, necessarily much better. It's just how parties try to sort of rationally deal with, the competitiveness of politics by selecting candidates who they think maximize, tick all the boxes. And so what makes you win also is not necessarily what makes you last. Well, evidently, right? And so the idea that by virtue of belonging to an elite, it's what helps you get into politics. But after that, it's, cutthroat competition, for the rest of your career. And as we saw, the career is likely to be very, very short. And so I think it's interesting that you sort of have a divorce between what are the criteria that help you get into politics and those, what makes you last. And there, well, proximity to leadership, but also the opportunity that people get to do good work, right? There are MPs who get rewarded for the work that they do, regardless in a way, of what their social characteristics are. So there has to be room for that too as well.
So let me pivot a little bit to the method question here, or data collection. I guess this is kind of an open-ended question for all of you, but what has surprised you the most about the process of gathering the data, cleaning it, things you didn't expect, things that were better than you expected, worse than you expected, more confusing than you expected, kind of on the social science thing? What surprised you as you've been working on this huge project? This is for anyone.
Yeah.
I think so one thing that I can stress on that definitely surprised me is how little existing tools. I mean, I'm sure this happens, and like we're doing this in India, but I'm sure like everyone does it. But existing tools really fail to sort of correctly get this very unstructured, very unclean data into a format, and typically we have to end up developing things mostly in-house. So that's how we ended up developing Surf. That's how we ended up developing a bunch of language processing tools, even in terms of correction, etc. And although, of course, like some of it can be expected because it's India and there's a very different, like we have a bunch of languages here, which of course, like NLP scientists sitting in the US are not really working on. But yeah, that is a surprise thing. And but of course, like we're glad that so through this, like somehow not only have we helped with the political side of things, but I'm sure like our tools are reusable for other data sets in India, like non-political data sets. So that is something nice.
And to that, I'd like to add that so if you get state data, every website will have a different structure and different data. And sometimes the caste data will not be available for one state, but for another, it will be openly available. So there's there's a lot of asynchronous nature in that. So yeah, that's very interesting that what is confidential, what is not, there's no say on it. Anybody does anything.
What it tells you, if I may, what it tells you also is that you need to do more than learn the basic of scraping, find a source, scrape everything, and then use the data. Even after scraping, even if you're a very good scraper, the data is almost never immediately usable. And you need a combination of technical but also domain knowledge, right? Knowledge of the data in order to make sense of some of these discrepancies, right? For example, when there's missing data, why is the data missing? Is it because someone forgot to enter it, or is it because there was a riot in that area and polling did not take place? Right, or took place in a bypoll later on, right? So you really have to get deep into the detail. That's basically how you learn about the data as well. But maybe that accounts in part, why the open data ecosystem in India is not, what it could be, because a lot of people say, let's put a few scrapers, let's, get a lot of data, together, and then they realize, okay, what do we do with it? And as this process shows, it takes actually a lot of work and thinking to make even basic data available and usable.
So we now, the chat has come to life here. So we have now not a lot of time, but several questions. So I was wondering if we could do kind of like 3 at a time, quick hits here, because some of these are maybe more technical or methodological questions. So first we have a question about what re-election patterns look like if we just held it to women alone. And so I don't know if any of you know that off the top of your head, but do you have a sense of kind of just, kind of conditional on gender, how re-election looks? Or is this something to explore using the online tools on the website, potentially?
Sorry, who are you addressing the question to?
Any of the 3 of you who want to jump in on this. I don't know the answer, but how does re-election look for women specifically?
All right. Yeah. So what we find is that once women get re-elected, the treatment they receive is not necessarily very different from the others. Obviously, when they struggle to get renominated, but like every other candidate, they struggle to put the funds together to lobby that for their renominations, but others. So it's not obvious that gender on its own creates a lot of disadvantages. Once you are elected, it's a very different story before. And as we saw, the numbers are pretty dire for the general population. And I don't have a sense that it's particularly necessarily worse for women. It's very competitive and very tough, really, for everyone.
Okay, thank you. There's a question about, and maybe one of our research engineers can help with this one. how to deal with the problem of similar names of politicians, right? Even middle and last names being the same. How do you pull this apart? And a second question on this issue of identification. Someone asked, is it possible to derive caste from names? So kind of how do we think about what information names provide and what they don't provide? And how do you deal with duplication?
So I'll answer the phone.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So for the first question, that SURF will be able to help. So SURF is a TCPD tool, which the question mentioned, whether it will be able to help finding these similarity in the names. So yes, it will help you build the clusters around the name. So the tool will pick up the similar looking name, and you can define the measure, how much similarity are you looking for, how many keywords you are looking for which should be similar. And the tool can build clusters, and you can then go to the clusters and manually somebody can decide whether these are same names or not based on other information also. So it will ease out most of your process by building those clusters for you.
Okay, great, thank you. And on names and caste, does anybody want to talk about that?
Yeah, so it really does not take you very far because obviously you can get started and then figure that a Yadav is a Yadav. But there are a lot of people with different surnames who are also Yadavs, and the surname will not tell you. And then you have Kumar and Singh and Varma, and that doesn't help you at all. And then one needs also knowledge about particular states, right? You can look, if you're not from Tamil Nadu and you look at a long list of Tamil names, that's not going to help you identify caste. In West Bengal, a lot of people have sort of adopted generic names to sort of hide their caste identity. In Bihar, there's a number of candidates in reserve seats who bear the names of Shukla, Pandey, and Chaturvedi, which are, arguably, very Brahmin, typical Brahmin name, but still they're contesting in reserve seats. So they must be, SCs. So you really can't use that as a method. It's only field data collection, right? You have to go on the field, talk to people, interview party workers, politicians, their drivers when the politicians are not available because they know the local journalists. And then you have to collect data from multiple sources, cross-verify, and so forth. It's a very lengthy, very lengthy process.
Thank you. Now, we have a question for any of you about candidate finances and assets, and kind of what do you have them? What can they tell us? How do they relate to some of these other variables? I think is a general question about kind of money, candidates, what do we know? What don't we know? I'd be interested in learning as well. Is that something that's part of the data?
Yeah, so yes, so we try not to duplicate what others do very well. So in this case, Association for Democratic Reforms has these statistical reports. It's very detailed. It's all in the open with, information of assets. So of course we integrate that into our analysis, but there's really no need to, reproduce the work that has been done well by others. But what we know about money is that obviously it's a key factor into getting selected as a candidate, right? The cost of entry into politics is absolutely enormous. And forget even campaign expenditure. It's a tiny amount. What people spend more to become a candidate in what I call informal primaries than what they spend on their actual campaign, because at that stage parties take care usually of a good deal of party expenditure, of campaign expenditure. And so that obviously has a terrible impact on inclusion of all kinds of groups, all kinds of vulnerable communities who simply cannot muster the resources necessary to and I was talking about implications, right? On the one hand, you have a high cost of entry, and on the other hand, you have the high probability of an early exit, right? And so that creates structural incentives to engage into all forms of predatory behaviors, because you have a very limited period of time to recoup your investment and make more money so that you can invest for possibly a future campaign, which is very, very uncertain.
Okay, thank you. So there's a more specific question about background of candidates, and I was looking back through the slides, and I'm not sure how it would be categorized, but there's a question about whether we know anything about those with administrative backgrounds like IAS or IPS, IFS running for office. I would also add military or police backgrounds, kind of out of the state bureaucracy. Do we know anything? Does that come under politics as background, other or unspecified, professional? But anything that you all might know about this particular trajectory? I assume it's not enormous, but I'd be curious if there are any trends here that we might be aware of.
Yeah. Neelesh, you might know?
Yeah, I think so. Typically, we do categorize them as government, but I think if you, if you can go back to the slides.
Well, at the top of my head, it's a handful of individuals.
Yeah,
it's pretty. So they get a lot of attention because when an IAS or a former 3-star general, 4-star general, run for office, it gets a lot of attention. But all in all, it's a very, very small number. If I remember from the 2019 Lok Sabha elections, there were more LIC insurance agents that contested than actually senior bureaucrats, which raises so many questions. But yeah.
Also, I think in terms of re-elected candidates, they typically end up identifying themselves as politicians or social workers at this point, because so by now they have been in parliament for 2-3 years. They cannot really call themselves former IAS officers anymore. Yeah. So in terms of tracking the performance, it's that's fine.
Yeah. But we now have a new data set on IAS, and so of course we're going to run surf between to see whether we find names in both and check whether there are the same people. So that would enable us to be more precise on this question, to have a more precise idea of this question.
Great, thank you. And that finding seems consistent with the broader themes of today's presentation about kind of what it takes to be a winnable candidate, which does not necessarily center on long bureaucratic experience. Okay, so unfortunately, I think we're now out of time. I think we're actually slightly 1 minute over out of time now, but I want to thank the audience. I know it's an evening in India and there are many things you could be doing, so thank you for being with us. And I also really want to thank our panelists for providing a wealth of both actual data, and then I found really kind of new and unique insights on where the data come from and how you get them and make sense of them and make them high quality. So thanks to everybody. Thanks to the staff at the Delhi Center for arranging all of this. And I hope you all have a good evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.